You're telling me 5 of the best mechanics in the country walked away, and a guy from a small-town garage thinks he can fix it in 10 hours? The challenge hung in the air above the polished concrete floor of Brooks Performance Motors, where a $500,000 engine sat open beneath bright shop lights. Several engineers exchanged looks. One of them laughed quietly. Across the room, Nolan Hayes wiped his hands on an old shop rag and said nothing. He had only come to deliver a rebuilt carburetor for another client. The late afternoon sun slanted through the high windows, turning floating dust into thin bands of gold. Near the service entrance, 8-year-old Maddie Hayes sat cross-legged on a rolling stool, sketching in a worn notebook balanced on her knees. She glanced up at her father. "Dad, are we staying long?" Nolan looked at the engine. Something in his expression changed. "Maybe a little longer than I planned." That answer surprised even him. Evelyn Brooks, the company's CEO, folded her arms. She had spent 3 weeks watching experts fail. Deadlines were collapsing. Investors were calling. Yet the quiet mechanic standing in faded jeans seemed less interested in proving himself than in listening to the machine. "You think you know something they missed?" she asked. Nolan stepped closer to the engine bay. His eyes settled on a single scratched component near the rear housing. "I think somebody fixed the wrong problem." The room went still. For the first time all day, Evelyn stopped looking at him like a temporary inconvenience. Outside, a Montana breeze stirred the cottonwoods lining the parking lot. The scent of cut grass drifted in whenever the bay door opened. Nolan spent the next hour studying diagrams while engineers watched with growing irritation. Maddie wandered over carrying her purple backpack. She pulled a small brass key from a hidden pocket and squeezed it in her palm before tucking it away again. Evelyn noticed. "What's that?" she asked. Maddie's smile disappeared. "Just mine." She turned and walked back toward her stool. The answer was simple, but something about the way she guarded the key lingered. Nearby, Nolan traced a finger across a blueprint and frowned. "Who approved this modification?" An engineer pointed to a signature. Evelyn's signature. A faint crease appeared between her brows. "That design came from my lead consultant." Nolan nodded slowly. "Then your consultant never understood how the original system was supposed to breathe." It wasn't an accusation. Somehow that made it harder to ignore. Evelyn looked at the engine differently than she had 5 minutes earlier. Not as a failed project. As something she might have misunderstood. The evening settled across the valley in long shadows and amber light. One by one, employees headed home. Nolan remained. He removed a damaged assembly and set it carefully on the workbench. "Dad," Maddie called softly, "you missed dinner." He checked his watch and gave her an apologetic smile. Before he could answer, Evelyn disappeared into her office and returned carrying 3 takeout containers from the diner down the road. "Nobody works on an empty stomach," she said. Maddie brightened immediately. "Do they have fries?" "Extra fries," Evelyn replied. It was the first genuine smile Nolan had seen from her. As they ate, Maddie accidentally dropped her sketchbook. A folded drawing slipped onto the floor. Evelyn picked it up. It showed a woman standing beside an old car beneath a summer sky. Nolan reached for the page a little too quickly. For a brief second, the warmth around the table faded. Maddie lowered her eyes. "I drew Mom from the picture in the hallway," she whispered. Silence settled between them, gentle but heavy. Outside, the last light disappeared behind the mountains. Inside the shop, the unfinished engine waited. So did questions nobody was ready to answer. The next morning, the question that lingered was not whether the engine could run. It was why the original design drawings did not match the machine sitting on the shop floor. Nolan stood alone beneath the raised hood before sunrise, a steaming paper cup of coffee forgotten beside him. The building was quiet except for the soft hum of overhead lights. He spread several copies of technical diagrams across a workbench and compared them one by one. Something had been changed years ago. Not recently. Not accidentally. Deliberately. When Evelyn arrived carrying a laptop and a stack of reports, she found him staring at the same section of the plans. You stayed all night? She asked. Nolan shook his head. Got here early. He tapped a finger against a faded notation buried near the edge of the page. Whoever made this revision never signed it. Evelyn looked closer. Her company tracked everything. Every test. Every adjustment. Yet this change carried no record at all. By mid-morning, the shop had filled with engineers, managers, and suppliers. The atmosphere felt different than the day before. Nobody laughed at Nolan anymore, but nobody trusted him either. He removed another component and held it beneath a work lamp. Tiny scratches circled one bolt. This has been opened before, he said. A senior engineer crossed his arms. Impossible. Nolan handed him the part. Then explain the tool marks. The man fell silent. Across the room, Evelyn watched the exchange. For weeks she had assumed the problem was mechanical. Now she was beginning to wonder whether someone had left a trail nobody wanted discovered. Before she could ask another question, a small voice drifted from the waiting area. Dad, look! Maddie stood beside the vending machines holding her brass key. She had attached it to a string around her neck. It will not get lost now. Nolan smiled, but the smile faded when he noticed something scratched into the metal. A tiny set of initials. He had never seen them before. Outside, clouds gathered over the mountains. The afternoon light dimmed. Maddie sat at a folding table drawing while Evelyn reviewed company files. Every few minutes, the little girl glanced at the CEO. Finally, she asked, Do you have kids? Evelyn looked up from her screen. No. Maddie nodded slowly. It gets lonely when Dad works late. The words were simple. They landed harder than the child intended. Evelyn stared at the document in front of her, but for several seconds she did not read a single line. Then her phone rang. One of the board members. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When she hung up, her jaw tightened. They want me to shut the project down by tomorrow. Nolan set down his wrench. What do you want? The question surprised her. Most people asked what the board wanted. Very few asked what she wanted. Evelyn looked through the glass wall toward the engine. I want to know why someone hid the truth. The rain arrived near sunset, tapping softly against the roof. Nolan finally located the source of the failure. It was smaller than anyone expected. One altered part. One hidden decision made years earlier. Yet before he could explain it, Maddie walked over carrying her sketchbook. A folded photograph slipped from between the pages and landed at Evelyn's feet. She picked it up. The picture showed Nolan, a smiling woman, and a much younger Maddie beside an unfinished classic car. On the back, written in faded ink, were 4 words. Finish it for us. Evelyn looked up. Nolan had gone completely still. The engine was no longer the only unfinished thing in the room. Why would someone write "finish it for us" on the back of a family photograph and never speak about it again? The question lingered through the next morning like the low clouds hanging over the Montana foothills. Rainwater still clung to the windows of the shop when Evelyn arrived before 7. She expected to find Nolan already working on the engine. Instead, she found him standing beside an old storage room at the rear of the building. The door was open. Dust floated through pale strips of morning light. Inside sat a classic car beneath a gray canvas cover. The same car from the photograph. Nolan noticed her and pulled the door halfway shut. It is not ready yet, he said. For a moment, Evelyn thought he was talking about the car. Then she realized he might have been talking about himself. The day moved quickly after that. Engineers gathered around as Nolan reassembled the final sections of the system he had spent 2 days untangling. The atmosphere had shifted again. People who once dismissed him were now asking questions. Some even took notes. Around noon, one of the company archivists arrived carrying several old boxes from storage. Evelyn had requested every document related to the project. Yellowed folders, engineering reports, supplier records. Decades of paperwork stacked across a conference table. She sorted through them while the smell of machine oil drifted in from the shop floor. Then she found something strange. A maintenance report describing the exact modification Nolan had discovered. The report was dated 12 years ago. The approval line was blank, but the initials stamped in the corner stopped her cold. They matched the initials engraved on Maddie's brass key. Across the room, Maddie was coloring pictures at a small table. Evelyn carried the key over carefully. "Sweetheart, where did you get this?" Maddie looked up. Her fingers tightened around a blue marker. "Mom gave it to me." "Do you know what the letters mean?" Maddie shook her head. "She said it belonged to something important. She told me never to throw it away." The answer only deepened the mystery. Evelyn looked toward Nolan. He was focused on the engine, but she could tell he had heard every word. That evening, after most employees left, she placed the old report on his workbench. He stared at the initials for several seconds. Then he sat down. "I have not seen those letters in years." It was the first time he had volunteered anything about the past. Outside, the storm had finally broken apart. Sunlight spilled across wet pavement and turned puddles into sheets of gold. Maddie wandered near the old storage room while Nolan and Evelyn talked. A few minutes later, her voice echoed through the building. "Dad!" The urgency in her tone sent both adults running. The canvas cover had slipped partially off the classic car. Maddie stood frozen beside it. On the passenger door, hidden beneath years of dust, was the same set of initials. The same ones from the key. The same ones from the forgotten report. Nolan closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, something had changed. The secret he had protected for years was no longer staying buried. And for the first time, Evelyn was close enough to see that whatever waited beneath that story frightened him far more than the failing engine ever had. What frightened Nolan more than the engine, the old car, or the forgotten initials? The answer did not come the next morning. It came in pieces. Thin fragments scattered across a day that began under a clear Montana sky and ended with 3 lives shifting in ways none of them expected. The classic car remained uncovered in the storage room. Dust no longer hid the initials on the passenger door. E.H. Maddie traced them with one finger before school. "Dad, who is E.H.?" Nolan paused longer than a simple question should have required. "Someone your mom believed in." It was not a lie. It was not the whole truth either. Maddie looked ready to ask more, but the school bus was already rumbling down the road outside. Back at the facility, Evelyn could not stop thinking about the matching initials. During lunch she drove 20 miles to the county records office in town. The building smelled of old paper and floor polish. She spent nearly 2 hours searching archived business filings and engineering permits. Most led nowhere. Then she found a name. Ethan Hartwell. An independent designer hired during the earliest stage of the project more than a decade ago. His contract ended abruptly 6 months later. No explanation. No follow-up records. Just a signature and silence. Evelyn stared at the page. The same initials. The same time period as the unexplained modification. When she returned to the shop, Nolan was tightening the final connections on the engine. "Who was Ethan Hartwell?" she asked. The wrench stopped moving. The room seemed to shrink around them. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked. It was the first time she had seen genuine alarm in his face. The afternoon passed beneath a tension neither of them acknowledged. Engineers completed final checks. The machine was closer than ever to running properly. Yet nobody seemed focused on it anymore. Near 3 o'clock, Maddie arrived after school carrying her purple backpack. She found Evelyn sitting alone with a stack of records. "You look sad," Maddie said. Evelyn laughed softly. "Do I?" The little girl nodded. "Sometimes Dad gets that look when he misses Mom." The words landed without warning. Evelyn looked out the window toward the mountains. "My dad left when I was 12. Maddie lowered herself into the chair beside her. "Did you miss him?" Evelyn considered the question. "For a long time." Maddie thought about that. "I miss Mom. But I get scared that one day I will not remember her voice." Either of them spoke after that. They did not need to. As sunset painted the western sky orange and copper, the final breakthrough arrived from an unexpected place. While sorting through an old box from the storage room, Maddie discovered a sealed envelope tucked beneath a loose floor panel inside the classic car. Her small footsteps echoed through the building as she ran toward Nolan. "Dad, I found something." Every conversation stopped. Nolan opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a photograph. Ethan Hartwell stood beside the unfinished car, smiling. Next to him was Nolan's late wife. On the back, written in fading blue ink, was a date from 11 years ago and a single sentence. "If anything happens to me, promise you will tell him the truth." Nolan stared at the words. Across the room, Evelyn felt her understanding of the story change completely. Ethan Hartwell was not connected to the mystery by chance. Somehow, he had been connected to Nolan's family all along. Why would Nolan's late wife leave a message about telling him the truth if the photograph already showed they knew each other? That question followed everyone into the next day. The envelope sat locked inside Evelyn's office, but its weight seemed to linger throughout the building. Outside, sunlight washed across the foothills after a week of changing weather. Inside, the project had entered its final stage. Engineers moved with renewed purpose. Yet every glance eventually drifted back to Nolan. Not because of the engine anymore. Because they sensed he was carrying a story larger than anything under the hood. Shortly after breakfast, Evelyn found him alone beside the old car. The gray cover was folded neatly over a chair now. For the first time in years, the vehicle stood fully exposed. Faded paint. Dust along the chrome trim. A dream paused halfway through its life. Nolan ran a cloth across the front fender. "My wife loved this car," he said before Evelyn could speak. The admission caught her off guard. He had spent days avoiding the subject. "Did Ethan Hartwell build it?" she asked. Nolan shook his head. "He designed parts of it." His hand rested on the hood. "He and my wife worked together before I met her." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Not enough to see the full picture. Just enough to realize how much remained hidden. Near noon, Maddie arrived carrying her purple backpack and a paper bag from a diner downtown. She set it on Nolan's workbench. "You forgot lunch again." He smiled. "You keep saving me." Maddie climbed onto a stool and watched him work. After a moment, she touched the brass key hanging around her neck. "Dad?" "Yeah?" Her voice softened. "Was Mom friends with Ethan?" The wrench stopped moving. The question had finally reached the place he feared most. Before he could answer, a call came through Evelyn's office phone. One of the board members. The conversation was brief and sharp. When she returned, her expression had changed. "They are sending auditors tomorrow." The room fell quiet. "Why?" Nolan asked. Evelyn looked toward the stacks of recovered records. "Because somebody thinks we are getting too close to something." The afternoon carried a different tension. While reviewing additional archives, Evelyn uncovered a missing section from Ethan Hartwell's contract file. Several pages had been removed years ago. Only one remained. A payment authorization. The amount was unusually large. Large enough to make no sense for a consultant. At the bottom sat the signature of a former executive who had left the company long ago. Suddenly the mystery surrounding the altered design felt less like an oversight and more like a cover-up. Evelyn brought the document straight to Nolan. He read it once. Then again. "This happened 2 months before Ethan disappeared." Evelyn stared at him. "Disappeared?" The word echoed between them. Nolan looked away toward the mountains beyond the window. "Nobody ever found out why he left." As evening settled over the valley, the final engine tests began. The machine responded better than anyone expected. Numbers climbed into target range. For the first time, success felt close enough to touch. Yet the greatest shift happened elsewhere. Maddie sat beside Evelyn on a bench outside the shop, watching the sky turn orange. "You know," Maddie said, swinging her feet, "I thought grown-ups always knew everything." Evelyn laughed softly. "Trust me. We do not." Maddie considered that. Then she handed Evelyn a folded drawing from her sketchbook. 3 people stood beside an old car. One spot remained unfinished. "I was waiting to see who belongs there," she said. Evelyn looked at the empty space. For reasons she could not explain, her chest tightened. And inside the building, Nolan unfolded one final page hidden inside the envelope. What he found there drained the color from his face. It was not a letter. It was a birth certificate. Whose birth certificate had been hidden inside an envelope for more than a decade, and why had Nolan's late wife protected it so carefully? The question followed him through a sleepless night. By sunrise, frost shimmered across the grass outside the facility, and the mountains stood sharp against the pale blue sky. Nolan sat alone in his truck with the document resting on the passenger seat. The name printed across the top belonged to Ethan Hartwell. The date matched the year he vanished from every company record. Yet one line mattered more than the rest. Listed beneath the child's information was the name of the mother. It was not Nolan's wife. It was Evelyn's mother. The discovery changed everything. By 8 o'clock, auditors had arrived from corporate headquarters. Dark suits moved through the building collecting files and asking questions. The atmosphere felt less like a workshop and more like a courtroom without a judge. Evelyn noticed Nolan watching them through the office window. "What is going on?" she asked. He hesitated. The answer sat folded inside his jacket pocket. For several seconds he considered handing her the document. Instead, he asked a question. "How much do you know about your mother's life before your father left?" Evelyn blinked. "Almost nothing." Her expression shifted. "Why?" Nolan looked away. "Because I think somebody spent years making sure you never learned it." The words landed harder than he intended. For the first time, the mystery was no longer connected only to the company. It was connected to Evelyn herself. By midday, the engine completed another round of testing. Numbers that once seemed impossible now appeared on the monitors. Engineers exchanged relieved smiles. Yet nobody celebrated. Too many unanswered questions remained. Outside, Maddie sat on a wooden bench eating grilled cheese from a diner takeout box. Evelyn joined her. For a while they watched pickup trucks roll along the highway beyond the fence. "Can I ask something?" Maddie said. "Sure." The little girl lowered her gaze. "Do people leave because they want to?" Evelyn thought about her father. About all the years she had spent wondering. "Sometimes they leave because they are scared," she said. Maddie nodded slowly. "That is sad." The simplicity of the answer stayed with Evelyn long after the conversation ended. Late that afternoon, one of the auditors uncovered a sealed archive box hidden in an off-site storage inventory. Inside were personnel records scheduled for destruction years earlier. Evelyn and Nolan opened the box together. Most of the files meant nothing. Then they found Ethan Hartwell's final report. The last page contained a statement written in his own hand. He had discovered a dangerous flaw in the project and refused to approve its release. Days later, his contract was terminated. Weeks later, he disappeared. Evelyn stared at the signature. "He tried to stop it." Nolan nodded. "And somebody buried the truth." The mystery surrounding the engine suddenly became something else entirely. Not a technical failure. A human one. As dusk settled across the valley, Nolan finally removed the birth certificate from his pocket and handed it to Evelyn. She read the document once. Then again. The color drained from her face. Her mother had known Ethan Hartwell. Known him well enough to keep secrets that survived decades. Evelyn looked up, struggling to reconcile the life she remembered with the life hidden on the page. Across the parking lot, Maddie waved from beside the old car, the brass key glinting against her jacket. None of them noticed the figure sitting inside a parked sedan beyond the gate, watching the building through a pair of binoculars before slowly driving away. Who had been watching the facility from beyond the gate, and what did they know about Ethan Hartwell? The question arrived before dawn. A security guard handed Evelyn a printed image from the parking lot cameras. The sedan was visible for only a few seconds before disappearing down the highway. The license plate could not be read. Yet one detail stood out. The driver had stopped directly across from the storage room where the old car was kept. Not the office. Not the engine bay. The car. Evelyn studied the image while the first light spread across the Montana Valley. Someone was not interested in the project anymore. Someone was interested in the past. Inside the facility, tension settled over the morning like a storm cloud. The auditors continued reviewing records. Engineers completed the final verification process. The machine that had consumed weeks of effort was now operating within every target specification. Success should have brought relief. Instead, it felt distant. Nolan spent most of the morning in the storage room. He sat on a rolling stool beside the old car, turning a faded photograph over in his hands. When Maddie arrived after school, she found him staring at the picture. "Dad?" He looked up. "Yeah, kiddo?" She hesitated. "Are you sad again?" The question carried no accusation. Just concern. Nolan folded the photograph and slipped it into his pocket. "A little." Maddie climbed onto the passenger seat of the old car. "I do not like when you pretend you are not." Her words landed harder than anything the auditors had asked all week. For a moment, Nolan could not answer. Then he reached over and squeezed her hand. By afternoon, Evelyn made a decision. She drove 40 miles to a small town north of Bozeman after discovering an address buried in Ethan Hartwell's final records. The road wound through open ranchland and golden fields. The house she found sat at the end of a gravel driveway lined with aging cottonwoods. An elderly woman answered the door. When Evelyn mentioned Ethan's name, the woman's eyes filled with recognition. "I wondered if somebody would come asking one day," she said. They sat together on a porch overlooking the hills. What Evelyn learned changed everything. Ethan Hartwell had not vanished. He had been diagnosed with a serious illness shortly after exposing the flaw in the project. He spent his final months trying to protect evidence that powerful people wanted erased. Before he died, he entrusted documents to two people. One was Evelyn's mother. The other was Nolan's wife. The sun was setting when Evelyn returned. Long shadows stretched across the parking lot. She found Nolan and Maddie sitting on the tailgate of his truck sharing a basket of fries from the diner. Neither looked up as she approached. "I know why your wife kept the envelope," Evelyn said. Nolan slowly stood. Maddie's smile faded when she saw the expression on both adults' faces. Evelyn told them everything. The illness. The documents. The promises made years ago. When she finished, silence settled between them. Then Maddie asked the question nobody else had. "If Ethan was a good person, why did everybody hide him?" No one answered right away. Because the truth was painful. Because the truth was inconvenient. Because sometimes fear lasts longer than courage. As darkness settled across the valley, another realization emerged. The envelope was never meant to protect Ethan Hartwell's secret. It was meant to protect someone else. And for the first time, Nolan believed he knew exactly who that someone was. If the envelope had been protecting someone all these years, who was it protecting from? The answer arrived the next morning in a way none of them expected. A courier delivered a sealed package addressed to Evelyn. No return address. No note. Just a worn manila folder. She opened it in her office while rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside were copies of correspondence between former company executives. Most were routine. One was not. Buried among the pages sat a memorandum discussing Ethan Hartwell's findings and the financial consequences of delaying production. Several signatures appeared at the bottom. One of them belonged to the former executive who authorized the mysterious payment. Another belonged to a member of the board who still held influence today. Evelyn read the page twice. What had happened years ago was never an accident. It had been a choice. Outside the office, Nolan was finishing the last stages of work. The machine that had brought them together now ran with a smooth confidence it had never shown before. Engineers moved around it with quiet satisfaction. Yet Nolan found himself thinking less about the project and more about Maddie. During lunch he drove her into town for burgers at a diner overlooking Main Street. Rainwater glistened on the sidewalks. People carried umbrellas between storefronts. Maddie sat across from him, twisting the brass key between her fingers. "Dad?" she asked. "Yeah?" She looked down at the table. "If I stop carrying this all the time, will I forget Mom?" The question settled heavily between them. Nolan stared at the key. For years he had believed the same thing about other objects. Photographs. Letters. The unfinished car. Pieces of a life he could not let go. He reached across the table and covered her small hand with his own. "No, kiddo," he said. "You do not remember people because of things. You remember them because they changed your heart." Maddie was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. That afternoon brought another shift. Evelyn shared the documents from the package with Nolan. Together they pieced together the final missing truth. Ethan Hartwell had uncovered a flaw. When he refused to stay silent, powerful people pushed him aside. Nolan's wife and Evelyn's mother had preserved evidence after his death because they feared it would disappear forever. The birth certificate had never been proof of a hidden child or secret family. It was proof that Ethan had trusted Evelyn's mother enough to make her the legal guardian of his records if anything happened to him. The misunderstanding that had shadowed the mystery for days dissolved. In its place came something more painful. Two women had spent years carrying a burden they could never explain. As evening settled over the valley, the rain finally stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds and painted the mountains gold. Maddie wandered into the storage room where the old car waited. A few minutes later, her voice echoed across the building. "Dad, come look!" Nolan and Evelyn followed her inside. On the passenger seat rested a small cassette recorder they had never noticed before. Age had hidden it beneath loose upholstery. Nolan pressed play. Static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then a voice filled the room. It was his wife's voice. Older. Fragile. Real. Maddie's eyes widened. Nolan stood frozen. "If you are hearing this," the recording said softly, "it means you finally found the truth. And if Maddie is with you, tell her something for me. Tell her she never needed the key to remember. She only needed love." No one spoke after the recording ended. Because for the first time in years, the answer they had been searching for was no longer hidden in documents, secrets, or old cars. It was waiting in the words she had left behind. The truth had finally surfaced, but what would they do with it? That question lingered through the final days of the investigation. The documents were delivered to the proper authorities. The board member whose signature appeared on the old memorandum quietly resigned before any public announcement could be made. The auditors completed their work. The mystery that had stretched across years no longer belonged to hidden files and forgotten boxes. Yet for Nolan, the most important consequence waited somewhere else. It waited in the silence that followed his wife's recorded message. It waited in the look on Maddie's face whenever her hand drifted toward the brass key around her neck. A week later, the valley was washed in bright autumn sunlight. Cottonwood leaves fluttered across the parking lot in shades of gold and amber. Inside the facility, employees gathered around the completed machine for its final demonstration. The numbers were perfect. Applause rose through the room. Engineers shook hands. Months of frustration had finally ended. Yet Nolan barely noticed. His attention drifted toward the doorway where Maddie stood beside Evelyn. The little girl was smiling. Not the careful smile she had worn for years whenever her mother was mentioned. A lighter one. The kind children carried before they learn how heavy grief could become. When the crowd began to disperse, Evelyn stepped closer to Nolan. "You did it," she said. Nolan glanced toward the machine and then shook his head. "We did." The answer surprised her. Once, she would have accepted all the credit or all the blame herself. Now she understood the difference between achievement and belonging. That afternoon, they drove the old car out of the storage room for the first time in years. Dust no longer covered the paint. Sunlight rolled across the restored bodywork as the vehicle eased onto a quiet road outside town. The mountains stretched across the horizon. Fields opened on either side of the highway. Maddie sat between Nolan and Evelyn on a blanket spread across a grassy overlook a few miles later. The wind carried the scent of pine and dry earth. For a while nobody spoke. Then Maddie reached beneath her jacket and removed the brass key. The object looked smaller than it had before. Less like a shield. More like a memory. She turned it over once in her hands. "Mom was right," she said softly. Nolan looked at her. "About what?" Maddie smiled. "I did not need this to remember." The words settled gently into the afternoon air. Then she stood, walked to the old car, and placed the key inside the glove compartment. Not because she was abandoning it. Because she no longer needed to carry it everywhere she went. The sun was beginning to lower when they returned to town. Long shadows stretched across Main Street. The diner windows glowed warm against the cool evening. Before they stepped inside, Evelyn stopped on the sidewalk. She looked toward the mountains. Then toward Nolan. For years she had built her life around control, distance, and work. Leaving always seemed easier than staying. But somewhere between the hidden records, the unfinished car, and a little girl afraid of forgetting her mother, something inside her had changed. "I turned down a transfer yesterday," she said. Nolan blinked. "You did?" She nodded. "I think I finally found something worth staying for." Neither rushed to fill the silence that followed. Later that night, after dinner, laughter drifted across the booth where they sat together. Outside, headlights moved slowly along the highway. Inside, the clink of silverware and the murmur of conversations blended into a familiar small-town rhythm. Maddie leaned against Nolan's shoulder. Across the table, Evelyn smiled at something the little girl had drawn in her sketchbook. The unfinished space from weeks earlier was gone now. 3 figures stood beside an old car beneath a wide Montana sky. No secrets. No empty outlines. Just people who had found one another after years of carrying things alone. And for the first time since his wife was gone, Nolan looked at the future without feeling like he was leaving the past behind. He was carrying it forward, transformed by love instead of anchored by loss.